Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Mojave Roadhouse. I am your guest and host today, John Grasson. We will be talking about the lost ship of the desert, the Jacobson story. This is primarily going to focus on the El Centro Imperial area, Nels Jacobson, Elmer Carver, and all of that. It will not include some of the other stories that the lost ship is about. We're going to focus on this today. First of all, I'd like to invite you to please share the video, comments, anything you have with your friends and neighbors and even the enemies. Let everybody know about it. Let's go ahead and try to spread the word and, try to get the thing to grow a little bit. Be fun. Today, you are going to be able to list your comments. I will forewarn you, any cuss words, any thing that really is inappropriate, you will be the comment will be hidden and you will be banned. So just got to be upfront. Okay, so let's go on with today's story. Today's story is about a hog rancher in the El Centro Imperial area who supposedly found the ship in his backyard. Nels Jacobson was he came from Highland, California, which is up northeast of Redlands, San Bernardino area. And he went down to the desert in the early 1900s. Back then, a desert land was 2-3 cents an acre. So he looked at an opportunity where he could go in and purchase a large area of land. He owned over 700 acres. And on this land, he basically raised hogs, alfalfa, and a few other things. And one of the nights when the Santa Anas came through, a sand berm that he had close to his house within about 200 feet was uncovered. And when that was uncovered, they noticed that there were boards and things that were unusual. By they, I mean him and his wife, Mrs. Jacobson. There was controversy out in whether if she was a younger or older woman, and we'll leave that alone for today. But in any case, they went digging in. According to the story, it took Nels a few days of digging to get inside. And once he got inside, he found a little 3x5 inch box that was full of jewels, rubies, emeralds, diamonds, topaz, just a ton of stuff that was in there. Even a 2.5 inch cross, which they think was with bluestone, which we believe may have been the topaz. In any case, Jacobson decided to sell the jewels. And you got to remember, this is early 1900s, so the antiquities law was brand spanking new. So he didn't want to get the government involved. So he went to his lawyer, and his lawyer got a hold of a pawnbroker in LA. And basically, they did a three-way split. In order to do that, he needed to hire somebody to watch the ranch while he was gone. And the guy that he hired was a guy named Elmer Carver. And Elmer Carver, just basically a transient. He was a 17-year-old kid looking to make some money. And while he was at the ranch, and this is a picture of the Nels Jacobson house, he noticed that the boards on the hog pen were a bit weird. They were long, they were thick, they were heavy. There were no nails used. There were bolts on either end holding the boards up. And they basically... he was kind of figuring out, well, how the hell could this happen? What's going on? So he asked Jacobson about it, and Jacobson told him, he said, well, I get them from ship. You got to remember, Jacobson was of a Norwegian descent, so his English was not as clear as a lot of people. He just spoke with an accent, basically. And so he left. Mrs. Jacobson the next day was talking to Elmer Carver about why Mr. Jacobson, or Jakey as he was called for short, left, and she told him all about the story. Now, when he heard this, he was like, yeah, okay. And then she says, well, let me show you. And she brought out that box, opened it up, and there was a massive ruby sitting on the top. And she said, Jakey said to keep this for a rainy day. And the ruby was worth more than all the other gems that were in the box. And there were still diamonds, emeralds, rubies, just any gem you could think of, it was there. So the next day, Elmer got up and decided to go out to see for himself. And after doing his morning chores, he went about 200 feet behind the house, and there was this sand berm and you could see the ship hanging out of it. He said the front end of the ship was about 6 feet tall, and the back end of the ship was about 4 feet tall. He did notice the boards. He noticed everything. So in reality, Elmer Carver was the last first generation, meaning the first person who actually physically touched the ship, saw the ship, and knows about it. It's not this guy who knew Bob, who knew Phil, who knew Sam, who heard about a story. This is a guy who said, no, I actually touched it. I actually saw it. So that's what we call a firsthand account. And that's really, really important on these things. So we're not quite sure what type of ship it was. When Jacobson actually left and went to the pawnbroker, when he got back, Mrs. Jacobson was livid because he had sold all the gems that he had, and he only got a third because the pawnbroker got a third, the lawyer got a third, and Jacobson got a third. And the reason she was upset is you have all these gems and minerals, and basically you only got a third of it. So it wasn't a good day at the Jacobson house, let's say that. Anyways, he basically came back. Elmer Carver said that he saw it in 1964. So you got to understand, this is about 50 years later. He did an interview with a couple of writers, and the writers said, let's go ahead and see, tell us your story. Well, according to his story, he met, I'm sorry, a little screw up here. He met Nels at a pool hall, and this is a picture of that pool hall. Nels was looking for day laborers, and that's basically how the two of them met. And he came through to see what's going on. I believe Jacobson had a ship on his property. I believe Carver actually touched and felt it. I don't know about the jewels. That's kind of, nobody's ever been able to prove that one way or the other. It's a great story. The guy finds the ship. According to legend, pieces of the ship were used or seen at a mechanics place out by Superstition Hill. There was a off-road group that actually came by and said, "Oh yeah, we saw we saw all the artifacts, blah blah blah," but nobody's ever been able to produce them. What's in question is what type of ship it was, because it's always been attributed to a guy named Juan de Iturbe, who sailed a Spanish ship, which most people believe is a caravan, but according to the paperwork and stuff that I've seen, it was actually a frigate. It's a little difficult to believe that a ship could possibly get up there, but then you have to also come back to in 1540, a guy named, I can never pronounce his, Melchior or something like that, Diaz. And this is the type of ship that he used, which is similar to a caravel. And he said that in the Colorado River, the low and high tides were 24 feet different. Now, if you go out to Yuma today and you look at the Colorado River, you look at it, you go, how can that be? Well, the Colorado River today has 3 dams on it, and it's nowhere near the size it used to be. There's pictures of Yuma back in the 1800s and early 1900s when it was flooded, and it flooded out blocks of the whole town. It's possible that a ship could have gotten up the Colorado and through a smaller river gotten into the Salton Sea area. By the way, if you have any questions or any comments or anything, please say so. We're happy to answer them right now. But once the ship got up inside, they thought that they were in what was called the Straits of Anian. And the Straits of Anian was a fictitious waterway that they thought led back to Europe a lot quicker. In those days, they thought that California was an island. So if you could find that waterway, you would be a world explorer. You'd be hailed across the universe, blah, 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 blah. So they were always looking for that. And if Iturbe went up through that river section and was able to get in there, then the first thing on his mind is that he would be a world-class guy. He would be just mega rich off of it. But the thing it's when he got to the northern end of the Salton Sea, it ran out. So he had to turn around and come back. Today, we think of things in time spans of minutes and hours. But you got to remember, back in those days, their time span was days, weeks, and months. So by the time he turned around and sailed, that sailing is not going to be down there in an hour. He's going to be there. It's going to take him a couple of days to get down. And then once he got down to the waterway that let him in, it had dried up to the point where the ship couldn't get out. And then the ship was stuck. Jacobson was a pearl hunter, a pearl fisherman. That was his whole focus. The thing about the Jacobson treasure, there was not mention of any pearls whatsoever. So it makes you kind of wonder, well, could it be a turbay? My first known account with turbay was from a book from the 1930s. And then you don't really hear about him until the Jacobson story kind of hits in the 60s, and then it kind of goes crazy with who he was and what he was. Wandia Turbay was an actual real guy. He was a ship's captain. He actually commanded several ships over his lifetime. He was a true guy. He was a legit sailor, legit man. But it's interesting how he came about. He actually sailed for the Cardonas, and the Cardonas was a conglomerate that was put together in Spain to come over to Mexico for pearl diving. They weren't the first. And in the pearl diving thing, they had 6 ships that left Spain. They came to the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean, they sailed around a little bit, picked up some more divers, and the divers were an issue because they didn't want Indian divers because they thought that they were going to steal the loot and run away, mutiny basically. So they picked up what they called Negro divers. Now, when they got to the Caribbean, after sailing around for about a year or so, they sold their ships. And I got to backtrack a little bit. Of the 6 ships that came over, only 3 actually made it across. So they had 3 good, solid ships, brand spanking new from Spain, sold them, and then traveled cross country. The military escort for Cardona was a guy named Basili. And Basili became sick when they were traveling overland. And they picked up Juan de Iturbe in Mexico City, which I always thought was strange. Why in the world are you picking up a sea captain in Mexico City? But once they got to the western side of Mexico, they required 3 more ships being built. In fact, Cardona talks about how angry he was because the cost of the ships was ridiculous. Now, I should say, when I mean Cardona, I'm talking about the nephew, because the nephew is the one who actually came to the New World. He'd been there before. He knew a little bit about it. And when Basili died, he was put in charge. And then, of course, like I said, he hired Iturbe. When they got to Acapulco, they ordered 3 ships to be built. The three ships took a while. And by the time they were ready to sail, there was a Dutch guy named Joris Spielbergen who was raising hell up and down the coast. And so they were commandeered to basically protect the port. And once Spielbergen was on his way and out of the picture, they were released. They did pick up a couple priests along the way. And the first thing Cardona did was he went over to Baja and claimed Cabo San Lucas for the King and Queen of Spain, which is odd. Why would he do that if he's a pearl shipper or a pearlman? There was a new book out, and I don't have it in front of me, written by a professor from the University of I think it was Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania. And she has uncovered a really unique thing. The reason she believes Cardona was allowed to do this is because he had what was an early version of a diving suit, because his whole claim to fame was that they could be able to go deeper and longer than anybody. And if they have a diving suit, they don't necessarily need Indian or African-American help. They could actually send down anybody they wanted to. Then it makes sense maybe to travel overland, because a suit could be hidden among all of your supplies, where if a ship is captured along the Horn, there's a good chance that somebody will pick it up and find out what's going on and use it for themselves. So he sailed there. They came around, they did some explorations and what have you. actually ran into Spielbergen where he commandeered one of the ships. And he says in his records that it was a frigate and not a caravan. And he thought it was a bit odd the way it was decked out, because it was decked out more for war than it was for pearl fishing. So there's some discrepancies in there. But if Iturbe did get up there, if he did somehow get into the area, according to the legend, he left the ship and walked 100 miles back to the nearest waterway, if you will, the Gulf of California, and tried to find help as quick as he could so he could get back. Charles, you're asking, has anyone ever gone to the house where the house was and excavated it? Well, the problem is nobody knows where the house was, because back in those days, the houses really didn't have a foundation per se. The picture that I showed earlier of the Jacobson house does show a front porch on it, but we don't know what it was. You know, back in the day, there was no running water. You had an outhouse. So anytime you wanted to, you could hook up a team of horses and just send the house anywhere you like. Now, this picture may have been taken after it was in more of a steady area and the porch was added. The house may have been moved prior to the porch being built. Nobody knows for sure. Jacobson left Imperial with $150,000 about 8-9 years later, which is an odd thing, because how in the world do you make $150,000 raising hogs? That's impossible. $150,000 in his day equals well over 3.5 million in today's money. So he's mega rich. How did that happen? Well, the only way it could happen is there had to be something else involved. Was it the fact that they were building irrigation ditches at that time, and maybe they bought some of his property for a huge amount of money? Or was it the fact that he had the lost ship treasure, or a combination of that plus how he raised the hogs? Nobody knows for sure. We do know that the ship was there as far as the stories go. One of the things that Carver said in an interview that I heard, and I won't go too much into that, is they asked him point blank what type of ship it was. And he said, well, the front end was sticking 6 feet out of the ground and the back end was sticking 4 feet out of the ground. It was kind of flat. He didn't really describe what in modern terms I would think of as a Spanish ship. He basically, to me, was talking more of a Viking ship, head up, feet up, and then a flat surface in the center. He said the top layer was missing. Well, they may not have had a top layer back in those days. He didn't talk about a captain's quarters and, you know, like the Diaz ship. If you notice the back of it, there's a high end to it and it's fully built up. That's where the captain's quarters and all the sailors slept and all that. None of that was described. And if that wasn't described, maybe it wasn't a Spanish or English type ship at all. Maybe the point is it was more or less a Viking ship. And that throws everything in a disarray. Nobody knows for sure what basically has happened. The property now is owned by several corporations. There's only one section of it is owned by a private landowner. Some of the TV shows that I've been on in the past, we actually went out and did some ground penetrating radar. We did LIDAR. We did quite a few things out there to see if we could find out if the ship was there, but we came up empty. The problem is nobody knows exactly where the house was, and you have 720 acres in which to search. And you know, it just makes it a little more difficult. Sorry, I got to drink something. You know, it's the manpower, the money, the type of stuff you would need in order to search everything would be horrendous. And realistically, I don't think there's any treasure on the ship in the means of pearls or diamonds or rubies or any of that. I think Jacobson probably cleaned it off pretty well. But I think also what happened, or what I also think, is if they do find the ship, any artifact that they could find I think would be a treasure within itself. If you find pieces of the wood, if you find cutlery, you find some of the ship's tools, the cups, saucers, cooking utensils, clothes, all that stuff would be just phenomenal. You'd have to more or less rewrite history. Here is some sort of a ship that is in an area that it's not supposed to be. And whether it's Viking or whether it's English or Dutch or Spanish, it really doesn't matter. Once you identify what it is, then you have to go searching in that particular area. It's interesting. To me, it's a very interesting story. Jacobson has this land. He's only there for 10 or 12 years. He becomes filthy, filthy rich. He leaves. Carver comes in for 4 days out of his life, and he now has a story to tell everybody for the rest of his life. And what's interesting is you don't hear much about Carver except for this story. He kind of comes in, says his thing, and leaves. And nobody really knows a lot about him. I do know that he was from the Valley area. He did have, I think he had a daughter. It's interesting to see if somebody could follow that lead and maybe see where that goes. Anybody have any questions? Anything you want to know? Just type it in down there. I think, how to put this? I think there was a ship. Again, who and what, where, nobody knows for sure. I do think that Carver was telling the truth. Carver was basically a transient in his early teens. He worked on the Arizona side of the Colorado River, basically making sandbags, filling sandbags for $1.25 an hour. And the place he was working at charged him 75 cents for food and lodging. So he's making 50 cents a day. And then when he was done, they were paid in script, and meaning the script was not cash. You had to wait 90 days to get paid. So here's a transient with no money and a piece of paper good for God knows how little money. But he found a guy in Yuma, according to the story, that was paying 30 cents on the dollar, or he was charging 30 cents on the dollar. So he went down there, got his money, was told that there was some work to be done or be had in the El Central Imperial area. So he went up there and went to the pool hall, and that's where he met Jacobson. And then Jacobson came in, looked at him. He was a big burly guy, figured he could handle the work, and came in and showed him the ropes, what he needed to do. And that was pretty much it. He came in, did the work, and then while he was there, Mrs. Jacobson showed him the treasure, if you will, and he left. Years later, according to Carver, he was going through the Imperial El Central area, and Mrs. Jacobson was at the train station, and she said that Jakey didn't pay him enough. So she tried to give him a $20 gold piece, and he refused it. So she left it on the train station floor. And then after she left, he felt, okay, I'll take it. So he picked up the money. Joey, you're asking, what about the missing pirate ship out of Cabo San Lucas in 1587? That would be the Cavendish ship, which is not part of this story. Cavendish is an interesting story, but I'm going to have to parlay that to a later time. We will be doing more of these shows. This one is particularly just the Jacobson angle. My belief is the Cavendish story has the most grit or teeth to it than of all the stories, and I really think the Cavendish story is interesting. But we'll do that on another time. Thank you for the comment. It's interesting. The thing to me was one of the things that was recorded is they recorded the pawnbroker's name as Barney. I mean, how in the world do you know the pawnbroker's name over 100 years? That's something that came from Carver. So, I mean, did you remember? You got to remember, Carver did this interview in 1964. Well, if he was 17 in the early 1900s, that's 50 years later. I don't know about you, but I don't remember too many things that I did 50 years ago. I might know a little bit, but I don't have that much of a detail in it. So you got to kind of take some of the stuff he says with a grain of salt. Then again, living as a transient, you may a lot of things that you go through at that time may have been embedded into your brain because of all the stuff that you went through. Be interesting to see if somebody finds it. I have a standing offer of $500 that anybody can prove that they have an artifact from the ship, that I would happily pay it. But we have to prove the artifact. If somebody comes up with a piece of wood and says, this is from the ship. Well, okay, let's go out and have it tested. This lantern's from the ship. Okay, let's go out and have it researched and double take on it. To this date, and I've been doing this for about 15 years now, nobody's ever been able to come up with viable proof that anything is a ship. I have people constantly say, I know where it is. It's over in the Superstition Mountains. That would be the Bill Post story. And I've talked to Bill a few times before he passed away. I've known his daughter for years. In fact, the ship you see over this shoulder, that was given to me by his daughter. That was Bill's actual ship model that he had. And it's kind of a neat little souvenir for me. I like it. Bill thought it was there primarily because they heard rumors from the off-roading group that was down in that particular area. And this is where the mechanic supposedly had the piece of the ship, a section of the siding and a lantern, but nobody's been ever able to prove that was true. The guy could have got a board from anywhere, could have got an old lantern, hung it up there and just said, oh yeah, it's from the ship. Gets people talking, people come by his shop and he gets a few more repairs that way. But if you know about it, if you see it and you're fully aware of it, I'm up for it. $500 anytime you want. So Jill says this is interesting. So thank you, Jill. We appreciate it. Joey, Steve, Charles, Babs, there's a few comments that we have here. It's a story for me that I think is just really compelling. It's hard to believe, and nobody really, there's doubters and there's believers. I always go back to the Helen of Troy story. What they call the father of modern day archaeology, believed in the Helen of Troy story. Everybody thought it was a fable. They all kind of just blew it off and said it wasn't true, until he actually found Helen of Troy's jewelry. And he had to have his wife wear it on the way out so he could sneak it out of country so he could verify it was a true story. And it's the same thing. I don't expect you to believe it. It's okay. That's my belief. It's what I see. It's the research that I've gone through. Anybody who reads this in the beginning is what we call the rabbit hole. You read a story and then you go, wow, is this true? Well, let's hit the internet. And then you find out Iturbe was a real guy. You find out Jacobson was a real guy. You find out Carver was a real guy. And you start digging into the story, and before you know it, you're deep down the rabbit hole and you can't get out. But that's okay. I love it. I think it's good. Patrick, not hard to believe that a ship could end up there. Both the Colorado and Laguna Salada tended to play tug of war with the Salton Trough. To some degree, that's true. The Laguna Salada is a water area very similar to the Salton Sea, south of the border on what I would call the northwest end of the Gulf of California. It has its own stories. It's got, again, some meat to it, but also how to put this, the flood of 1906, 1904, 5, and 6 filled the Salton Sea, and everybody says it was an accident. Well, in a way it was, but that's not to say the Salton Sea has never been filled on its own with no manpower whatsoever. Through the years, it's filled, drained, or I shouldn't say drained, I should say dried up over the years, and that's what left the salt content. Because a lot of times the water would come from the Colorado River. It would also have the water from prior to the cutoff on the Colorado, where actually the Gulf of California went all the way up to Indio. I believe Jacobson was just scared. and he didn't want to get anybody involved. So he was very quiet, very hush. He may not have told his family anything about it. Mrs. Jacobson, if she was willing to tell Elmer about it, I would assume that she may have told more people, but that's early. You know, it's 100 years ago. How are you going to trace that down? Sorry, my throat dries out when I talk too much. Jack Lee loved reading the stories in Desert Magazine. Coral and Jack Pepper believed that Coral was David Keir, a good friend of mine, knew Coral quite well. In fact, Coral left him a lot of her personal belongings. And David actually is the man when you want to talk about anything Baja. He's been down there for 30, 40, 50 years and is an expert on the missions, the history, the culture. Good man. And Coral was good people as well. Her and Jack, you can't thank them enough for keeping Desert Magazine alive. Desert Magazine to me was just a massive inspiration for pretty much everything I've done. We get back to the Jacobson story. My question is, and I think Patrick, I think, who was it again? I forget. Charles, and when you were asking about the house, the question is, where was the house and how do you find the house? You got to look at, to me, where the town was, where his property was, and where would you put your house? If you're constantly going into town for supplies and that, I don't think you're going to put the house on the back end of the property. I think it'd be more on the front end. There were some clues in the interview that I heard with Carver, but I'm not really going to go through a lot of those right now because some of those I want to keep kind of private for a while, and then I can come out with it a little bit later. But I think the western end of his property would be where to look. And, it's just tough to do because the land's owned by corporations, and corporations don't want you to go traipsing around their property. And down in that area right now, that's a big agricultural area. And we met during one of the filmings, we met one of the guys because he was wanting to know what we were doing down there. And we were filming not on his property, but on an adjacent property. And he was talking about the plants and stuff they use down there. There's some really high tech things that they're doing, and they don't want somebody coming in and stealing their plants to try to duplicate what they're doing. So they're very, very protective. There's always somebody around there. You might think there's nobody there, but you can be there, and within a matter of 2 or 3 minutes that you're there, somebody's coming in asking you questions. So you got to be careful. And it's from a corporate view. This is our product. This is what we do. So I can see why they don't want anybody traipsing all over their stuff. And then again, there's the historical side to me that goes, well, yeah, I'd still love to find out if it's true. And how do you know? How do you know where the house was? You would think through the years when they clear the land, they do what's it called? It's like they dig deep into the soil to kind of turn it over a little bit. And they do that every so often. You think that when they did that over the years, they would have found something, a piece of the ship would have tore up, or an artifact, something somewhere would have come up. And, when you ask people around the neighborhood, you ask people who've lived there for most of their lives, nobody ever says that ever came up. Now, are they hiding something? Could be. Nobody knows for sure. Ted, I agree with you. David is a great guy. He's good people. For where I'm from, they call him, he's got a good soul. And that's the highest compliment you can give. Back to the house. What's interesting is there's a house that looks similar down there, but it's a little bit off the property line and you're not quite sure. And it's kind of nerve wracking to knock on people's door and say, oh, I think there's a ship in your backyard. It's unbelievable. It's one of those things where you just got to be kind of cautious about how you approach people. I have approached some. They have allowed me to look around. Nothing came up of it. But, there's a saying that an old miner said that I just thought was really cool. They asked him where the gold was. And he says, well, I can tell you where it's not. And I think that it kind of applies to the ship. I can tell you where it's not. But we've done um, myself, film crews, for the last 14, 15 years. We've been all over this property. I don't know if it's an Iturbe ship. My personal belief is I kind of pull that aside. Iturbe actually returned to Acapulco via the archives, via the records. But again, we're dealing with Spanish records, and Spanish records are not absolutely true. I mean, you have to also think about how much gold and treasure was hidden into the ships that were headed back to Spain that they didn't tell the king and queen about, because the rich guys didn't want to pay 20% on everything they had. So Cardona says that he has written account and says that the ship did return, and that it was commandeered when he had to return to the Caribbean, and it was sunk over there. Nobody knows for sure. But if Iturbe did return and the ship was lost in the Caribbean, that really kind of shoots him out of the lineup. Then I go into the Vikings. Could it have been a Viking ship? By Elmer's description, yeah, quite easily. It's just, how in the hell would a Viking ship get across there? Well, if you go back to, I think it's 950 to 1150 AD, the Northwest Passage, as we call it today, which was frozen, which we know it to be frozen. Back in those days, they were going through a medieval warming period, and it was actually passable by ship, passable by a Viking ship. Now, when I say a Viking ship, I'm not talking about your big long ship. I'm talking about a mercantile ship, which is similar to the one I'm showing here, and that's called a Nar, Knarr. You notice the point on the front is the same. You can't see it in the picture, but it's also the same point in the back. I think they could have come around. I think they could have come down Alaska. They could have come down Baja. In fact, on the west coast of Baja, there is a petroglyph of a ship that looks eerily similar to a Viking ship. And then if you come around to Tiburon Island, which is in the Gulf of California, they have a legend of the come from afar men. And I think that possibly could have been Vikings. Supposedly they left with some of the local Indians and went up north, and they were never seen again. So maybe that's the ship that was there. Maybe it was beached, the water, nobody knows for sure what the water line was back in those days. It just got to be too much for them to carry, and loaded what they had and took off. Maybe that's where the giants of Arizona come from, the old Viking guys. You think of the Indian stature back then, they weren't very tall people, and a big burly Viking comes around, and maybe that's where that came from as well. Maybe they were trying to get to the Kensington stone in Minnesota. Who knows? So that's basically what we have on the ship. To kind of recap a little bit, Nels Jacobson and his wife had property in the El Centro Imperial area of Southern California. There was a sand berm in his backyard. When the Santa Anas hit, it uncovered what he thought was a ship. Took him several days to dig through it to find out if there was anything there. Found some gems and pearls. Went to the local pool hall. Went to the local pool hall. Hired a day worker by the name of Elmer Carver to watch over while he went to LA to sell the gems. While he was there, Mrs. Carver showed Elmer some of the jewels that they didn't sell, that they kept for themselves. Carver went out 200 feet behind the house to find where the ship was. It was there. He physically touched it. He physically looked at it. He identified it in his mind as possibly a Viking ship. But the story came out that it was a pearl ship, because pearl fishing around the northern end of the Gulf of California was prevalent at that time. And that story took off. Few years later, 8 to 10 years later, Nels Jacobson leaves the area, decides to sell his property and move. According to a newspaper count, it was 100 to 150,000 is what he made in his time there, which would put it at 2.5 to 3.5 million in 10 years. That's phenomenal. So nobody knows for sure what happened to the ship, where Jacobson's house was to identify where the ship was, or pretty much anything else. It's a great enduring story. I've heard that people use the wood to make additions to their houses. I've heard, again, that it was in a mechanic's place. I've heard people have taken some artifacts. I mean, it's anything under the sun. You've heard it, but there's been no viable proof one way or another. So nobody knows. You know, would I love to get an academic group involved? Absolutely. I would love nothing more than to have a proper dig being done once we identify an area. So I think it's important for us to try to identify that area. And once we find that, then bring the academics in and let them do their thing. Because if they could find stuff, man, that's great. That's incredible. Until then, I'll keep digging. I'm going to end the show there. I thank you very much. I hope it wasn't too over the top. Please come to my Facebook page, which is the Mojave Roadhouse at Facebook. Of course, got to put in because there's another Mojave Roadhouse. I hope you liked the show. Thank you very much. Please share with your friends, neighbors, and enemies. And I'll see you the next time. Bye.